Something extraordinary is unfolding in Washington, and for once it is not being driven by the opposition. It is coming from inside the president's own party. For the first time in a meaningful and sustained way, Republicans themselves are moving to constrain Donald Trump, not rhetorically, not symbolically, but structurally. They are quietly positioning themselves to block the very powers he is attempting to consolidate, even as he escalates his language, raises the stakes, and frames every limit on his authority as an attack on the nation itself. This is not another partisan flare-up or a fleeting moment of intra-party disagreement. It is a test of whether American power is governed by law or by personal will, and the outcome of this test will shape how authority functions in the United States long after today's headlines disappear. What makes this moment so unsettling is not the noise surrounding it, but the realization that the real action is happening away from cameras. Late at night in Washington, phones light up across Capitol Hill. Senior aides whisper in hallways. Senators reread messages twice, not because they misunderstand them, but because they cannot believe they are being forced to confront them. The President of the United States is furious, not at Democrats, not at journalists, but at members of his own party. And this time, the resistance is not coming from protests outside the gates or critics on cable television. It is coming from within the walls of power itself. History shows that this is where the most dangerous confrontations always begin, because internal resistance threatens something far more destabilizing than opposition. It threatens control. Republicans are no longer merely uncomfortable with Donald Trump's behavior. They are actively reassessing the costs of enabling it. This is not the familiar cycle of MAGA infighting, anonymous leaks, or performative dissent designed to calm donors while preserving loyalty. This is something colder, more calculated, and far more consequential. It cuts directly into the one thing Trump has always treated as non-negotiable: unchecked authority. The revolt matters not because voters feel betrayed by broken promises, whether those involve no new wars, economic relief, or promised disclosures that never materialized, but because lawmakers themselves are now challenging the foundation of his power. When internal guardrails begin to activate, presidents rarely respond with restraint. They escalate, they dramatize, they frame limits as emergencies and resistance as sabotage. That pattern is playing out in real time. What we are witnessing is a presidency leaning hard into spectacle and crisis language in an effort to shield itself from internal collapse. The danger here is not theoretical, it is structural. Because at the center of this revolt lies a reality that even seasoned Washington veterans are struggling to articulate without sounding alarmist. The President of the United States has publicly entertained the idea of using military force in ways that could entangle America in conflict not with a distant adversary, but with its own allies. When Senator Chris Murphy articulated this in plain terms, the impact was immediate and jarring. Once stripped of branding, bravado, and ambiguity, the scenario becomes impossible to ignore. Greenland is not a bargaining chip or a real estate abstraction. It is territory belonging to Denmark, a NATO ally. NATO's core principle is collective defense. Any military action against that territory would not be symbolic or rhetorical. It would trigger legal and strategic consequences that place the United States in direct confrontation with Europe. The fact that lawmakers must now explain this publicly is itself a measure of how destabilized the conversation has become. No American voter endorsed a presidency that risks armed conflict with allies over acquisition rhetoric, yet the system is now forced to treat these ideas as actionable because dismissing them as jokes is no longer responsible. This is where Republican resistance becomes critical. Members of Trump's own party understand that once military action is framed as an option, the machinery begins moving regardless of congressional intent. History shows that rhetoric precedes reality, and they know that congressional silence can be interpreted as consent. That is why the War Powers Act has reemerged, not as an abstract constitutional debate, but as an emergency brake. When Republicans joined Democrats to advance a resolution limiting the president's unilateral authority, it was not accidental. It was a recognition that once a president normalizes threats of force, especially against allied territory, Congress becomes irrelevant unless it reasserts itself. Trump's response to this reassertion was not persuasion or negotiation. It was rage, profanity, intimidation, political threats. The reported phone call to Senator Susan Collins was not merely about a vote. It was about shock. Shock that loyalty had limits. Shock that submission was no longer guaranteed. For Trump, this resistance feels existential because his entire political strategy depends on projecting inevitability, dominance, and personal control. Nothing undermines that projection faster than members of your own party publicly saying no, particularly when the stakes involve war, constitutional authority, and institutional boundaries. Faced with resistance, Trump did not retreat. He reframed. He reached for emergency language, not merely as a policy tool, but as a political weapon. The declaration of a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets fits squarely within this pattern. Emergencies allow him to centralize authority, bypass debate, and cast himself as the sole guardian of national security. They transform dissent into obstruction and oversight into disloyalty. The underlying reality is far more complex, involving long timelines, uncertain infrastructure, massive corporate interests, and benefits that would primarily accrue to multinational energy firms rather than ordinary Americans. But complexity has never been the point. Dominance is. Emergency declarations shift attention. They rewrite rules. They crowd out uncomfortable questions. And there are few questions more uncomfortable for this administration than why long, promised transparency initiatives have stalled, why document releases have been delayed, and why bipartisan pressure was required to move oversight forward. When lawmakers like Sheldon Whitehouse begin speaking openly about Inspector General compliance failures and missed timelines, they are not issuing accusations, they are identifying process breakdowns. That distinction matters because process failures invite scrutiny, and scrutiny threatens control. Trump's political survival has always depended on exhausting the public, flooding the information space, and ensuring that every controversy competes for oxygen. This is why the Republican revolt, the war powers dispute, the emergency declaration, and stalled disclosures are not separate stories. They are the same story viewed from different angles. They reflect a presidency attempting to outrun accountability by accelerating chaos. Republicans who once rationalized every action as temporary are now weighing the long-term damage of silence against short-term loyalty. They are recognizing that inaction is no longer neutral, it becomes complicity. This shift has transformed internal party dynamics. Senators are no longer asking how to protect Trump from the next headline. They are asking how to protect institutions from irreversible erosion. When the War Powers resolution advanced with Republican votes, it was a calculated decision by lawmakers who understand that precedent outlives presidencies. If unilateral threats become normalized now, they will not disappear later. They will belong to whoever occupies the office next. Trump's fixation on legacy intensifies this conflict. His desire to be remembered as dominant, transformative, and historically consequential increasingly collides with the reality that his promises have not produced stability or restraint. When the myth of no new wars erodes under the weight of military rhetoric, even loyal supporters begin to fracture. War is not abstract to voters. It carries cost, risk, and consequence. Republicans facing re-election know that no amount of branding can sell conflict with allies as strength. Emergency powers therefore feel less like leadership and more like panic. Historically, leaders who feel authority slipping reach for extraordinary measures to freeze the political moment in their favor. In Trump's case, the Venezuelan oil emergency exemplifies how economic interests are reframed as security imperatives to justify centralized control. Lawmakers across the aisle see this not as strategy, but as distraction. A deliberate attempt to shift attention away from oversight, internal dissent, and unanswered questions. Trump does not merely seek support, he demands submission. Senators who assert independence are treated as traitors. Careers are threatened publicly, even as their votes remain essential privately. This contradiction exposes the fragility of power built on fear rather than coalition. Power that relies on intimidation eventually turns inward, and that is precisely what Republicans are beginning to recognize as they quietly coordinate, compare notes, and decide where lines must be drawn. The concern driving this resistance is not ideological, it is constitutional. When a president signals that personal judgment supersedes law, treaties, and precedent, it creates a world view in which rules exist only when convenient. Lawmakers understand that such a world view does not end with one presidency. Precedents, once established, persist. That is why routine votes have become flashpoints and policy disagreements have escalated into existential tests of institutional survival. Public confusion and fatigue amplify the danger. A crowded information environment benefits those who thrive on chaos. If everything is breaking news, nothing is accountability. Trump has always understood this dynamic. But Congress is not an audience. It is a co-equal branch, and some lawmakers are beginning to behave like it again, pressing for subpoenas, demanding explanations, and following procedural trails that do not bend to narrative dominance. The focus on delayed disclosures illustrates this shift. Senators questioning timelines and compliance are not alleging conclusions. They are identifying red flags. Red flags matter because they demand answers. Inspectors general operate outside political theater. They deal in records, memos, and chains of decision-making. Their work does not vanish with a rally or a tweet, and this is precisely why it unsettles the administration. Processes accumulate, paper trails persist, deadlines do not forget. Every time scrutiny tightens, the administration widens the narrative, external threats are emphasized, emergencies are declared, stakes are raised. This reflex is not subtle, it is instinctive, but oversight is not reactive, it is deliberate, and that deliberation threatens a leadership style built on speed and spectacle. Republicans now face a question they can no longer postpone. Is stopping a president from exceeding constitutional limits betrayal, or is it preservation? Increasingly, they understand that history does not remember who defended power, it remembers who restrained it. Silence, once a shield, has become a liability. This moment feels heavier than past controversies because the resistance is no longer performative, it is institutional, it is procedural. It is driven by lawmakers who may disagree on policy but agree that authority justified solely by personal will, insulated by emergency language, and enforced through intimidation is incompatible with democratic governance. Trump senses this shift. His rhetoric has grown sharper, his framing more apocalyptic, his reliance on emergency powers more frequent. Leaders who feel control slipping do not slow down, they accelerate. They demand loyalty tests. They insist that only they can prevent collapse even as their actions generate instability. This paradox defines the current moment, a leader obsessed with legacy but constrained by process. A party torn between alignment and survival, institutions forced to choose between performance and function. The temptation for observers is to dismiss this as another chapter in an endless political drama. That would be a mistake. The real question is not who wins the next argument. It is whether the rules governing power remain stronger than those who temporarily hold it. That question belongs not just to politicians, but to the public itself. Systems do not fail overnight. They erode gradually until someone finally says no. Right now, that no is coming from within, from Republicans who understand that responsibility sometimes means restraint, even when it is politically costly. Whether that restraint holds will shape not just this presidency, but the balance of power every future president inherits. That is why this moment matters. That is why it demands attention beyond outrage. Because democracy does not defend itself, it depends on people willing to uphold it when doing so is uncomfortable, inconvenient, and risky. What happens next will not be decided by declarations or threats. It will be decided by whether limits still mean something when power meets resistance, and the world is watching to see if those limits still hold.